All right, it's about time for us to welcome our speaker. Will everybody please find your seats? Oh, Janet says that I should say to you all, parade sit. It had an effect. I may try that again. Parade sit. Very good. I like it. Something for the repertoire. All right. Oh, yeah, is there a word for that too? Okay. Tension. Okay, yes. Tension. Very good. All right. Our speaker, Janet Horton, is a Christian Science practitioner and a retired Army chaplain. When you see even a brief list of Janet's assignments, it makes you say, wow. Here are a few. Janet was the first woman assigned as a division chaplain in the Army. She served in Albania, Macedonia, and Kosovo. She was the executive director, Armed Forces Chaplain Board, the director of training at the U.S. Army Chaplain School. She was at the Pentagon in 9/11 and subsequently advised the Department of Defense on Muslim issues. When you hear Janet talk about some of the experiences that she's had along the way, it makes you say an even bigger wow. And by the way, Janet's book, Cracking the Camouflage Ceiling, is available just inside the door there at a table. It's $20. So if you'd like to get a copy, please do so. Everyone, Janet's going to talk with us today about the great heart of divinity. Please join me in welcoming Janet Horton.
I often tell people that know me now that when I was about 13 years old, before that I was so shy I could never look another human being even in the eyes, and they go, I can't believe that. So, today we're going to take a look at some spiritual ideas that would impel a year of gratitude and celebration of Christian Science, loving, caring nursing. I began by searching, of course, two sources. I bet you could name them. The Bible and Mrs. Setti's writings. And one of my favorite passages from the Bible has always been 1 Corinthians 12, 4 and 5. Now, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are differences of administrations, but it is the same God which worketh all in all. I think any time you come to a Christian Science nursing facility and see what the nursing folks do and what the administration accomplishes, you're just thinking God is working here. It's inspiring to see how beautifully Christian Science nurses and the staff manifest what I'd call a holy spirit. And they have such a holy sense of their work. They do it diligently, they do it with kindness, and it's a type of diligence and kindness that's felt. We're going to talk about that. It reflects what Mary Baker Eddy refers to as the great heart of divinity. In Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy states, the rich in spirit help the poor in one grand brotherhood. Anytime someone in our Christian Science facility is in need, the nurses and the administrative staff meet both the human and the spiritual needs, and those needs are addressed spontaneously and in multiple ways, and it's just amazing to see what that looks like. I thought we might review kind of the basics of what Christian Science nursing represents. And I love Mrs. Eddy says to begin rightly is to end rightly. So that's why, to me, I always begin with the Bible and Mrs. Eddy's quotes. From Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy says, with one Father, even God, the whole family of man would be brethren. With one mind, and that God, or good, the brotherhood of man, would consist of love and truth, and have unity of principle and spiritual power, which constitutes divine science. What you don't see, it's interesting to me because what you don't see at Christian Science nursing facilities, and never have experienced walking through that door, is in hymn number 236, encourages us and says that the stars in their courses never contend. Now in California here, people refer to stars and you think of Hollywood stars. But the stars that we have here that are truly stars, and I don't mean the one in the skies either, but the people who are bright and shining examples of truth and love are the nursing folks here in the facility. And the idea of love embracing the whole family of man is what you feel when you walk through that door. And it prompted me one time. I was getting ready to take a trip to Germany, so it was going to be a long overseas flight and everything. And I thought that I wanted to study that sense of the wholehearted way that we lovingly approach each other in Christian Science, and see that love was manifest. It's not what's called a mere abstraction. It's manifest. And so the first thing that happened is we had a ton of people in this great big airport, and they announced that there was going to be a 4-hour delay. And then, of course, you're going to have that whole overseas flight. And so immediately people began to run over to get something to eat or different things. And there were 2 passages that I looked at as I was sitting there initially, and one's from Miscellaneous Writings, page 250. Love cannot be a mere abstraction or goodness without activity and power. And if you look up the definition of an abstraction, it says it's not based on specific examples, but it has the implication to say that something's abstract would say it had no meaning. So what you want to see is love is not, Mrs. Seddy says, not a mere abstraction. And so it does express activity, and it has a deep, heartfelt meaning. Yours is an inspired work at Broadview, so you would see this every day as you walk up and down the aisles here, or from room to room. And the other thing that came to me was from page 558. The mortal sense, to mortal sense, science seems at first obscure, abstract, and dark, but a bright promise crowns its brow. Now, the last word on earth you'd ever apply to Christian Science would be dark, and it'd be the last word that you would ever think about in terms of what Christian Science nursing does. But the last part, she says it's a meaningful work, even though, and I think sometimes people might think, well, that would be a really tough job, but the way these people do it, they do it with such a heart aflame with love that it isn't dark in any way at all. It isn't, and you think about all the things they have to do. I mean, there's some pretty tough stuff that nurses have to do, and you never hear any contention, you never hear any whining or anything like that. It's just the opposite of what you think. So I was thinking about these ideas as I was sitting there waiting for this flight to get going, and the first thing I speak German, and so I heard this German family talking that they'd already turned in all of their American money, and so they had no money to eat anything. And so I was so joyous that I could go over and knew enough German, I can usually get my point across, and told them that I would like to buy them lunch to thank them for how wonderfully the German people took care of me when I was in Germany. And they were just shocked that somebody would even figure out that they had a need, let alone that they would then try to help. And so we had a wonderful time. We ate together, and I was able to practice my German some. When we finally boarded, I was praying that the children too, because I was thinking the adults were talking with each other, and there were several children. You tell children you got to wait 4 hours to even get on the plane, and then you're going to be on this plane forever. I was thinking that I would pray for the children, and so there were several children that the stewardess talked to and everything, and I thought it was very sweet that they did that. And as they came down the aisle with a little cart thing that they always offer the beverages and everything when we finally got going, and I knew this little boy was sitting right behind me, and he was about, I guess, 6 or 7 years old tops. And it was so interesting because when the stewardess asked him what he wanted to drink, he looked at her and he goes, "I'd like to have chocolate milk." And she looked at him, she goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we don't have chocolate milk. And I'm a little odd. Anytime I fly, I get a bottle of chocolate milk and a bottle of white milk. So I thought, wasn't it sweet that God put me sitting right in front of this young family? So I just turned around and handed the mom my bottle of chocolate milk. And I says, well, would it be okay if I gave this for your son? She goes, yes, give it. But I thought God was rewarding him for how lovingly he had gotten through that 4 hours of waiting. And it was interesting because as I continued to think about that, I was thinking about how children do feel that so lovingly. And so, and this was a second leg of the flight, because I had yet another leg once I got there. And it was so interesting because on one side, about 4 rows ahead of me, I was really praying about the children again and how they could feel love. And it was so interesting because this little girl, and I would guess she might have been 5, leaned out of her chair like this and turned around to look back at me because I'm on the other side. And she looks back at me and she starts going, and so I just thought, you know, Mrs. Eddy is really on the mark there. And I don't think that's different than what Christian Science nursing is about. It's our prayer. It's the metaphysical work that we do. It's not just the amazing way in which the nurses do what they do, but it's that they have that sound metaphysical basis. They have studied what love is with a capital L. When I was at the Army War College, the Rand Corporation was teaching us stuff, and I shared with them how Mrs. Eddy would capitalize love or capitalize truth when it was a synonym for God, and they're like, I love this idea of this capitalization thing and the difference between just human sense of truth and then what absolute truth would be with a capital T. So even the Rand Corporation thought it was a really neat idea. It's striking how many people who pray understand the Gospel of John and that God is love, because that's one of the places you see where the synonyms, Mrs. Eddy pulled those synonyms right out of the biblical passages. And I love to think of that and how it's expressed in very, very unusual ways. A friend of mine shared with me an experience. There was a Christian academy that had a football team, and they were playing a team and the whole team was from Youth Correctional Facility. And kids that had been troubled and been in this correctional facility. And so they noticed when they got ready to start the game that there was not a single person on the side where the correctional facility people were. And so this head of the school went over and he asked the cheerleaders if half of them would be willing to go over and cheer for that team, and they very lovingly agreed to do so. And then he went up to where the stands were, where all the people were, and said, could you have the people over here, could you go over there and cheer on the correctional facility? And those people got right up and went over there and did that. And when the team came out from the locker rooms, the cheerleaders put their pom-poms, is that what they're called, up like this and made an arc. The guys came out running just looking like unbelievable. You know, they never had experienced anything like this. And for the first time in their entire history as a football team, they actually scored 2 touchdowns. And it was interesting, even though they lost something like 40-14 or something, at the end, everybody came together and hugged on the field. And it was so interesting because the young men who were playing the football from the correctional facility said they'd never had a day like that in their life ever. And they said it was the first time that they had ever experienced feeling valued. And so that's what I think people feel in these facilities, is they feel a true sense of being valued. Another question we can ask is, how powerful is it to perceive the perfect man in even a single other person? Because I think that's so central to Christian Science. A woman had decided to take a shortcut through this park, and it was in a very downtown area, and it was a very big city, and it was freezing cold, and that's why she decided to take this shortcut through this park. And she noticed when she got in there that there were homeless people sleeping on the benches. And it was interesting because then she was sitting there thinking, oh, I wonder if I should have really done this. I probably shouldn't have brought my baby in my stroller right up by these homeless people. And just as she was thinking that through, the baby noticed the man who was the homeless man sleeping on the bench, and he looked over at the homeless man, and he went, you know how babies do that little wave like this? And the man, prior to that, had looked very inebriated. But when that little baby waved at him like that, he sat up, and the woman said it was as if his eyes cleared, and he just blew the baby a kiss, and the baby blew a kiss back. And so you see how powerful it is. And then she said, well, the baby taught both of us to perceive the perfect man. So you never know who it is that's going to be teaching somebody to perceive the perfect man. It could be a little tiny child. Mary Baker Eddy wisely noted that the effects of Christian Science are not so much seen as felt, and that's page 323. This comes to my thought a lot, and in a lot of different ways. The examples we've already talked about reminded me of when I wrote a letter of recommendation for my neighbor who had 2 young sons, and for the first time he was going to apply to colleges and everything, and he asked if I would write him a letter of recommendation. And I wrote it for him, printed it out, signed it, got him all set up with it and everything, and his mom gave him the letter. And the next day I was walking in my backyard, and he came tearing through the fence, came walking over to me, and gave me what I can only describe as a crushing hug. And he's about 6'4", so I'm not underestimating that there. And he looked at me, and here's this big, 6'4" kid crying and saying, I've never in my life had anybody see me the way you saw me in that letter of recommendation. So even the tiniest thing you do, when you see that perfect man, and what I had done was listed all the qualities he had that I thought would make him a wonderful student. And he did get accepted right away, but he was just as moved by it as the people who read it at the college. So it's often interesting how many different ways we have an opportunity to see that perfect man. I would recommend to you to seek to understand how listening also, it's not just writing something or perceiving something, but listening is very much a part and would be part of what supports effective Christian Science nursing. And I was in the Army War College. This is like the senior service college that when you're getting ready to be a full colonel you go to, and it's rare that lieutenant colonels get sent to this college, but I was a lieutenant colonel and got sent, and I was the first woman to be selected for this war college that was a chaplain. And in the 256 people, I think we had 3 women in the entire class. And it was interesting because you had these seminars, and so I'm, of course, the only, in the military, most of the time you'd say, okay, I was the only woman there. And so all this whole year we'd be in these seminars talking about everything. And one day I noticed one of the colonels came in, and he sat down, and you could just see he was just crushed about something. And I asked him if things were okay, and he said, no, I'm not okay. And I said, well, what's wrong, And he said, well, my daughter just turned 15, and he said, we've been so close all the time she's been growing up, and he says, I just feel like I'm losing her. And he said, I just don't know what to do. I can't even get her to hardly respond to me. And so I said to him, well, would you be willing to try something? And he said, I'll try anything. And I said, okay, tonight you go home and you ask your daughter if she'd like to talk. And the key thing I want you to understand here is what you're going to hear in your head is that she's going to talk. And I said, what I want you to do, I said, if you have to put duct tape on your mouth or sit on your hands or whatever you have to do for 15 minutes, I don't want you to say anything other than you can nod your head that you're listening or say, oh, okay, or something like that, but you can't talk. You have to actually listen to your daughter. And I said, and if you can do it longer, do it longer. And it was very interesting because the next day he came in and he was oh, yeah. I was like, oh, wow, how did it go? And he says, we sat there, and he said, she talked for almost an hour. And he said, at the end of the time, she jumped up and she ran over and she gave me a big hug and she said, Daddy, she said, that's the first time you've listened to me in probably 4 or 5 years. So even a young person in their teens, it's striking to them how many people aren't the best at listening. We're very good at talking, but not so many folks are as good at listening. When I was in the Pentagon, we had a famous newswoman come and talk at a thing, and I was so struck by the way she put it. She said, the highest compliment that you can pay someone is to pay attention. And I wrote it down, and I thought, and that's what, again, what you feel when you come in these Christian Science nursing facilities, is you see the nurses actually paying attention to the folks that they work with and are, whether they're visiting or there to read and study or whatever it is, you just feel the difference when you walk in. Listening with all your heart is one of the toughest qualities. I noticed that, I'm sorry, I lost my place on here. Okay, they all said that there wasn't an experience with the staff or their faculty at the school that was similar to what had happened in when I explained what a facility like this would do in terms of actually speaking to people, making eye contact with everybody. We had a woman from our church, and she was in a care facility because she lived so far away from a Christian Science nursing facility, she couldn't get in there. So a bunch of us from our church went to visit her. And we sat at lunch with her and 4 or 5 other people at the table. And we talked and shared things, and it was a very loving experience. And at the end of it, the women said, and none of these people were Christian Scientists other than the lady we were there to visit. And they said, wow, this is the first time we felt like somebody's actually spoken to us and listened to us, and that we actually existed in their sight. So there's a striking difference between what sometimes people feel in other types of facilities versus a Christian Science nursing facility. We also never know when it is that we're going to be called upon to provide even a small semblance of what I would call care for a fellow person that you might experience in your day. It requires that alertness to duty Mrs. Setti talks about in the manual. It requires us to want to help other people and to actually be looking for that to be the case. My husband and I once a year go up to Montreal to the Rogers Cup tennis tournament. And so we have to ride the subway to get to where you would see this tournament. And we went in and we went through all these 4 hours of hot tennis things. Sometimes those matches go on for over 4 hours. And when we came out at the noon break, I think the temperatures that year were 97 degrees, and it was also quite humid. And everybody was looking for a little piece of shade to get into, and so I was right up against this building with my husband's grandchildren, his two granddaughters. And I looked over, and there was this man sitting on this cement thing, and it was to a air conditioner sort of thing, and he was sitting on it, and he was like this. You know, he was completely bent down, and he couldn't even lift the top part of his body up. And I went over to him, and I said, "Sir," I said, "are you okay?" And he said, "No, I'm not. They've called the medical people, and they're supposedly coming, the rescue folks." And so I said to him, I said, "Well, would you want to sit and repeat the the 23rd Psalm?" And it was so interesting, because even though he's like this, he's looking up at me like that, and he goes, "I would love to do that." And so we just held each other's hands, and we repeated the 23rd Psalm. When the medical people came in, I didn't want to be in their way, so I just backed out of the way, and so the girls and I were still watching to make sure everything was okay, and they got him into a wheelchair, and they were getting ready to wheel him off, and he was still like this in the wheelchair. And all of a sudden, you saw him reach over and grab the arm of the guy who was pushing his wheelchair, and he stopped him. And he took his arms and he picked himself up and turned himself around and looked at the girls and I and went. Now, I've never seen a gesture like that before. It was very moving, and I thought, wow, you know, that's amazingly beautiful. So we went back in, we saw the afternoon part, and so when you get out of these tennis tournaments, there's hundreds and hundreds of people trying to, in Montreal, get back on the subway system, and they literally crush into the cars. And so when we got done, everybody ran down to the metro, and we're all just smushed in this car. And there were two young boys, and they looked so much alike you could tell they were brothers. And one of them started to get up and said, "Ma'am, would you like to have my chair?" And I said, "Oh, you're so sweet." I said, "But we just sat for 4.5 hours in an Ndal match." I said, in horrendous heat. And I said, "And we're only going 2 stations because we change to a different line." And he said, "Oh, okay," you know, so he sat back down. And all of a sudden, his brother began to throw up all over. And it was interesting because with all those people in there, it was all going down on the floor, and there were old newspapers that people had been standing on. So he's trying to pick up the old newspapers and wipe himself off. So I reached in my bag, because with the girls, I always keep lots of napkins and everything. So I was helping him, giving him fresh napkins and cleaning them off and everything. And he just looked at me, and he stopped throwing up. He just, his eyes cleared up and everything. And so when we finally got to the second stop, he and his brother got off because they were closer to the door. We were kind of on the other side of the crush. And so when we came out, we were so blown away because his brother and he stood there and did this. And the girls were going, "What is this?" You know? And so we're thinking, wow, you know, so we're driving from Montreal back to Vermont. So there's a place where you have to go through the border, and the crossing guards are all there. And so we had to take a comfort break, and so we went into this monstrous place where everybody eats and everything. So we're in there, and the line for the rest stop was so long for the women. I went over and I saw 4 of the crossing guards eating. And there was a prayer that I wrote that's a poem for the firemen who helped us in 9/11 in the Pentagon. And I had copies of it with me, and I gave it to them. And I said, "This is a poem I wrote for the firemen. And it's called The Best in Human Character." And I said, "I think you guys have one of those thankless jobs." And they said, "Oh." It was like, "Oh." And one of them said, "I've worked here 12 years and no one has ever said thank you to me." Another one 9 years, another one 10 years. You know, they all said how many years they worked doing that job, and never had anyone even said thank you for what you do. And so they were very moved by that. So we finally got our rest stop. We go out, and we come out, and there were little white vans sitting right there, and the 4 of them stand there and go. And so that they feel the genuineness. Now, you know, people can pretend to be nice or whatever, but when you see a Christian Science nurse do what they do, you feel the genuine love there. And I think they were feeling a genuine sense of love. And it was interesting because for years since, and this happened probably all within the space of about 8.5 hours, I've met people from Canada, especially from Montreal, and I've asked them, "What does this mean?" And showed up the gesture, and they said, "I've never seen it before." Because I was thinking, was it a French thing? Was it, you know, something that they just did in Canada or what? Never once have I had another Canadian say they have ever seen it. And so to see it that many times, 3 times in a row in that day, and I think it's from the heart, thank you, or something along that lines. But it's when it's genuine that Mrs. Setti said the effects of Christian Science are not so much seen as felt. It made me think of this passage from Science and Health. It's from page 205, and it says, "Befogged in error, the error of believing that matter can be intelligent for good or evil, we can catch clear glimpses of God only as the mists disperse, or as they melt into such thinness that we perceive the divine image and likeness in some word or deed, which indicates the true idea, the supremacy and reality of good, and the nothingness and unreality of evil." So it's sometimes we perceive the divine image in some word or deed, and you see that in these facilities. The daily prayer gives us this direction. And may thy word enrich the affections of all mankind. It's everyone that you encounter, and govern them. And to me, it's such an encouragement, again, how universal love is. And you have to ask yourself, are there folks we could encounter or share with that aren't subject to a law of universal love? There couldn't be anybody, if it's universal law, then there couldn't be anybody who wouldn't be subject to that universal law of love. In Miscellaneous Writings, page 224, Mrs. Eddy instructs her students to be determined not to be offended when no wrong is meant, nor even when it is, unless the offense be against God. This is one of the most valuable lessons I felt that's had an impact on my career in the Army. At the United States Army Chaplain School, we had all these chaplains from South America come in, and all of them were priests except one. And it was interesting because they wanted to be taught about ethics, and so I had several degrees in ethics, and the only other woman chaplain that I've ever served with was there too, and she had a background in ethics. So I came up and told all these South American chaplains that they were going to be taught by 2 women chaplains. And they were not thrilled about that idea. But it was so interesting. Karen's background comes from a church that doesn't even ordain women. And yet her bishop called her and ordained her and convinced her entire denomination that the call was so clear and so real that he was going to ordain her as a woman chaplain. She's to this day the only woman who's ever been called as a woman chaplain. An amazing, amazing lady. And so she and I were teaching this class, and it was interesting because about 2 days into it, it was about a week-long course, about 2 days into it, the leadership that had brought them there, and we had escorts that would translate Spanish and everything, and they all said, we have never seen anybody disarm a group that was so upset so quickly as you and Diana. So we were just, or Karen, I'm sorry, we were just so moved to see how quickly love disarms hate. And Mrs. Eddy says in page 264, we can utterly disarm erroneous suggestions. Anytime there's an erroneous suggestion that there can't be harmony, with scriptural authority. So you don't have much higher authority than scriptural authority, by an all-absorbing spiritual love. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about all-absorbing spiritual love. I think that's an amazing characteristic. Ephesians 3 says, Christ may dwell in your heart. Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend and know the love of Christ, which passes all knowledge, that you might be filled with the fullness of Christ. Now, I've heard people say you're full of it, but this is a very different sense. This is exactly what we want to be filled with, the fullness of Christ, that pure way of looking at every person we encounter. Never underestimate how it may be that somebody feels the power of love. It may not be spoken, it may not be something that you did or whatever, but I was asked to speak in a historical Episcopal church in Micanopy, Florida. The movie Doc Hollywood was done there because it's all historic stuff. And it was interesting because this church prided themselves on that this was this antique church, and they didn't even have a sound system. But it was supposedly built just perfectly architecturally, so that if you stood at this one podium like this, people could hear everything you said without these mics or anything. And so there was a Sikh and there was a Muslim who talked about their tradition, and then I talked about mine. And they had about an hour and 15-minute service prior to that, and so I was the last speaker. And I was just praying and just reveling in the idea that these people in this Episcopal church were so willing to hear about Christian Science, willing to open their hearts to try to understand more clearly what we believed in. I was just really reveling in that idea. When this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "Could you speak to me outside?" And she kind of pointed her head outside, and I said, "Well, okay." And so she explained when we got outside that she had attended that church for 9 years. And she said they always have everybody speak from that podium, and they don't have nobody that she's ever been in the church there when they've spoken. She said, "I've never heard a thing. I only go to church because I feel like my place on Sunday morning is in church." Now look at this woman is valuing church so much and recognizing that her place on a Sunday morning is in church. And even though she's never been able to hear anything, had gone there for 9 years. And she said, today, she said, "I didn't hear a thing anybody else said. But," she said, "I heard every word you said." And she began to repeat stuff to prove to me that she actually heard what I had shared. And I just was so moved by the fact that I think she felt the prayer that I had done about how beautiful it was that those people were willing to hear and had actually demonstrated that in her life. Another thing that I love about, I had a dad, and my dad and I were kind of opposites. He was 6'4" and about 265 pounds, and was given a full ride scholarship to Michigan State to play football. And I was the size of second graders when I was in 6th grade. So they call me the Gidget in my family. And so my mom let me go with him once when he was selling the tools that he had invented. And it was interesting. About the first 3 places we went into, a couple of car dealerships and then another bigger kind of a gas station type of thing, and nobody would buy a tool. And I was so impressed that my dad took me, and when we came out, here's this monster huge guy and this little tiny girl, I'm holding on to his hand like this. And as we walked, he said, "Now take a step," and we took a step, and he said, "Sorry, I'm grateful I have a daughter." And then we took another step, and he pointed at me, and I said, "I'm grateful I have a dad." And then the next step, he said, "I'm grateful we have a car." And we took another step, and I said, "I'm grateful we have a place to stay tonight." And all the way to the car, and all the way to the next place where he was going to sell, we each went back and forth and said what we were grateful for. And the entire rest of the day, he went in and he sold billions of tools. It seemed like everything he did, they bought multiple numbers of tools. So I know the title of this was about gratitude, and I want you to see what a foundational thing that is. And you can't come into one of these facilities without being grateful for what they do and seeing how gratefully they do what they do. Do I have time for one more piece? Okay. Like I said, if you don't put duct tape over my mouth, I talk. When I was in Germany, I had 2 planners, and so you would only have a planner for about a year. And the first one was a Mormon, and so we would drive across Germany, 4 or 5 hours trips and everything. And so it would go quicker if you'd share stuff about your tradition. So he would tell me about the Book of Mormon, and I'd tell him about science and health. And so we got to know quite a bit about each other's traditions. And then the next year I had a Methodist. And same thing, we'd be driving all over Germany, and he'd tell me about the Methodist Church, and I'd tell him about Christian Science. And so it was interesting, about 2 years later, I had now rotated and gone back to the States, and the Methodist and the Mormon gave me an email, and they explained that the Methodist and the Mormon had been at a big conference in Germany, and the Methodist guy had gone out to run, and he had stepped in a hole and twisted and really hurt his ankle. And the Mormon had opened the door for him when he came back, and he said he couldn't hardly even get in the door because he couldn't put any weight on the foot or anything. And the Mormon said to the Methodist, he said, "Oh, it's too bad Chaplain Horton's not here, or we could have asked her for a prayer treatment for your leg." And it was interesting because the 2 of them said, "Well, we used to talk about how you do a prayer treatment." And they got to talking and said, well, maybe we could do one. And so they shared the ideas that they remembered about what a Christian Science treatment was. And it was interesting because the first thing the Mormons said to the Methodists was, well, now what were you thinking about when you were running? And the Methodist guy said, oh, it wasn't the right thing. He said, I was priding myself on the fact that I'm a chaplain, and I was running better than most of the combat arms guys I work with. And he said, yeah, he said, I wasn't thinking of the right stuff. Then he said, but the other thing she would have asked me is, what are you afraid of? And he said, the first thing I thought of was I had a sprain that wasn't even anywhere near that bad, and it was over 6 weeks before I could run again. And I was thinking, it's going to be months before I can run again. And the Mormon said, well, you don't have to accept that. And so they started sharing passages from the Bible, because they said, oh yeah, the next step is we need to go to the Bible and see what the Bible says about something like this. And so they were sharing passages back and forth, and it was interesting because within about 2 or 3 days he was walking, and within about a week he was running again. And so they wanted me to know that they felt they had learned how to give a Christian Science prayer treatment. So I think it's wonderful to see how open to the ideas about Christian Science healing people are. Page 400, mortals obtain the harmony of health only as they forsake discord and acknowledge the supremacy of divine mind and abandon their material beliefs. So they were, instead of turning to that whole thing that I got to go to the medical clinic and I got to get my leg looked at, they right away abandoned the idea that that's what the first thing was they needed to do. Because one thing they had remembered was that instead of seeing prayer for healing as the last resort, they had remembered a Christian Scientist would see it as the first resort, and many times, and almost always, the only resort. And so they had grasped that concept also. Now, I said that I would take some questions. So would somebody like to ask a question? One back here. Right back here.
Thank you so much for your talk. Can you please express how we can pray about the current political situation?
Well, we are talking about harmony, right? Yeah. I think if you look at how a Christian Science prayer treatment is given, the first thing you're not going to accept is what the material picture is in front of you. And so, over and over again, in the examples I gave today, it truly is about perceiving the perfect man. And it isn't as if you'll notice 3 or 4 of the quotes that I quoted talked about the supremacy of spirit. What is this supreme power? It's not what we call governmental power. It's not the Congress. It's not all of the things that politics would like to say power is. I think we really have to get a clear concept of what power is. And I have to often look and say, I'm not going to accept what the TV's presenting. I am not going to accept these erroneous concepts of our fellow beings, whether they're people that seem to politically agree with you or don't politically agree with you. It wants us to be divided. And so to me, I constantly look at, and it's interesting because Unity of Good, page 8 says, is anything is real of which the physical senses are cognizant. And if you take the cognizance of what you're going to hear with just your physical senses on the news, you're probably going to go, ooh. But Mrs. Setti says here on Unity of Good, everything is as real as you make it and no more so. Now, I look at this thing a lot. I go back and I read that opening sentence, just bam. Everything is as real as you make it and no more so. What you see, hear, feel is a mode of consciousness. and can have no other reality than the sense you entertain of it. What I noticed is, having traveled to many nations and everything and been in all sorts of different political types of situations, what the politics seemed to be in the Balkans, and yet what we felt from the people that we actually worked with were day and night. And so I generally like to think about, let's not think about what's being magnified out of proportion, because that's animal magnetism on the TVs and what everybody wants you to think in something that's not the Christian Science Monitor. And try to look at what is the truth of being. And so when you talk to the common folks, they aren't usually any part of that whole political to-do and the whirlwind that goes around it. And so you see that what they want is they just want an opportunity to be with their families, to love their kids the way that we love our kids, to love our families the way that we love our families. They'd like to find a way to do something in their life that makes meaning come into their life. And you see that people throughout the world, no matter who they are, when you look at the genuine, regular folks that you deal with, wherever you are, they're God's children. And I think we have to hold to the fact that we want to see the supremacy of spirit, not the supreme thing of let's stir people's emotions up and let's get them to magnify things out of proportion. So we have to acknowledge that God is governing. That's the only true government that exists. I really work very regularly with the only true government that exists is the government of divine mind. And that unifies, it doesn't divide. And those are just a few thoughts. And people could look at it 50, 60 other ways, I'm sure, as well. Yeah.
Thank you for your beautiful speech. I would like to just add one thing. My teacher was one of the first chaplains in World War I, sent in the Navy. And I wear the uniform. And everything you're telling, everyone who's here will be blessed, because then, after he came back from World War I and lectured, he was sent to Germany to quiet down Hitler. I didn't know at that time that they wanted to take the practitioners in Germany also. So the work you have done has really been a blessing for everyone. I want to thank you, and everyone here is blessed. And I want to thank also Broadview. So I've been here before, and they bless all of us. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Yes,
Sir.
Hi, I was really moved by the last story you told about the chaplain's camaraderie, and it made me think of what Mrs. Eddy's intents were before she started the church, and this idea that Christian Science is this new revelation interpretation of Scripture that opens the healing power of the Scriptures, and she wanted to share it with other students of the Bible. And so the story you just told is like, oh my God, that was it. That was it in its example. And I'm just wondering, how else can we do that other than chaplaincy? But I'm also wondering, was that inspiration that you felt in that experience, did it lead you to think about other things you would like to do in that way? In the chaplaincy, would you like to have support in doing more of sharing across religious lines?
Yeah. I just wrote a book called Cracking the Camouflage Ceiling, and there's a bunch of examples in there, but one that's not in there that was very striking to me was the military chaplaincy. I wrote a thing for the Department of Defense, and it was called the Religious Support Primer, because nobody can understand the military chaplaincy, because there isn't anywhere else, not in any other military in the world or whatever, where chaplains of different traditions, that many, over 200 traditions, work together harmoniously for the large part. And to me, it's a miracle. That was the opening sentence, was that, you need to understand the miracle of the chaplaincy. And so what I explained about was, wherever you are, if you're off in the Balkans, or if you're in Germany, or if you're in Korea on the DMZ where we were, or whatever, the thing that you're thinking about is, what is the next thing that person needs, and they wouldn't care if you were a kangaroo, if you have something of peace to say to them for the situation that they're looking at. And so I don't like to divide my world up into Christian scientists and non-Christian scientists. I don't look at them that way. Some of them may not have discovered they're Christian scientists yet, but I truly see them as Christian scientists. And so because of all the difference in the military chaplaincy, all the churches that have chaplains have what's called an endorser. And they have to say, this guy really is a Catholic priest. He didn't just kid you and say he was, you know. And somebody has to say, this guy really is a Christian Science chaplain or whatever. And so these people, these 200 and some groups, meet together once a year. And there was this horrendous debate over public prayer. And I mean, the endorsers were yelling and screaming at each other. And I mean, they were just, a bunch of the conservative Christians were saying, no matter what you do in a public place, when you give a public prayer, you have to allow the Christian chaplains to say, in the name of Jesus Christ, as the closing of the prayer. And so that there were other people that realized how that had caused such a division among the military leadership that they'd stopped having a prayer at the Army-Navy game. If you'll notice, a long time ago, they won't even let them pray publicly at the Army-Navy game anymore. And so the chiefs of chaplains are two-star generals, and these people that are endorsers were, you know, pinging them. What answer do you have this? Where do you think we should be doing with this? And they didn't even want to answer, so they said, "Oh, Janet, why don't you answer?" You take the heat rounds in the chest, okay? So I said to him, I said, this is a very sophisticated issue, and I explained. I said that there's two words here, public and prayer, and it depends on how you define them and how they're related to each other. Because if you say a public prayer is merely a private prayer that a Christian would say in a public situation, then that's one interpretation which many people make. I said, but the real question is can there be such a thing as prayer, public prayer, that's for the public? Because in our formations, I said, I'll share with you, I had a colonel come to me and he said, when I was supervising chaplains, he said, I will never, ever allow any chaplain to give a prayer in anything I'm involved with for the rest of my military career. He said, I asked my chaplain to come and bless, at my change to command, bless all my new troops. And he came and he only blessed the Christian ones. And he said the Muslims, a number of folks who weren't Christian left very angry. And he said, I will never allow that because that's not public prayer. And so I said, you know, this is kind of a sacred cow with everybody, and some of you are arguing is that the cow just can't give chocolate milk or strawberry milk or whatever, it has to give vanilla milk, or I said, it's really a sacred cow. And I said, but you have to ask yourself, if the way in which you do it is so alienating people that there aren't any more cows out there anymore, then will you be satisfied with what you're accomplishing? And it was interesting, they were very, very quiet, and so that kind of stopped the discussion, and we had a break, and we went outside, and all of the conservative guys just backed me right up against the wall and said, I can't believe you said that, you betrayed us, and they were just angry as ever. And they said, why would you do that? And I said, well, why wouldn't you want to think about it differently? And they said, well, you can't tell us what to think or something like that. I said, I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just giving you an example. I said, there's only one prayer that Jesus Christ himself gave us, and it's in the Bible, and it doesn't fit your construct. And it starts with our Father. And it was so interesting. Everything just broke up. So you have all kinds of experiences where you're there to express the truth, and you're listening. It's not that you feel like, I don't know where, I don't feel like I came up with that answer in that particular one, or in any of these. I just feel like you get to that spiritual position of attention I talk about. But, so it's not you, it's the truth being uttered through you. So.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question.
last night I just finished your book, getting ready for this. When you were going to the Boston University, you'd go Monday through Thursday, and Friday you would work with the Mother Church. How does the Mother Church support you as a Christian Science chaplain when you're on active duty, when you're out in the field like that? How do they do that?
Remember me talking about the endorsers come together, the people who are designated by the Mother Church. I was the endorser for quite a while, and we had an endorser when I was in, of course. Sandy Sandberg was an endorser for a while. Some of the other folks you'd know of were endorsers. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Say again what you were asking about the... Oh, how the Mother Church said, yeah. So in order to feel like we're prepared to go into the military as chaplains, because it is such a different thing, while you're at seminary at Boston University, it's the only seminary anywhere that gives you 70% of your tuition. My sister went through seminary at Berkeley, and in a 20-some year career, she finally paid off all her debts the day she retired. And so Boston University has been very supportive of our chaplain program, and they're very inclusive in the way in which they teach their classes. So the Mother Church wants us to know what public thought is on everything. So, you know, PTSD or whatever they're thinking about there. And so then we come over to the Mother Church when we have our actual sessions with the endorser. And so then we're going to teach them more of the things like we talked about today. And share how you don't, and it's interesting again, if you don't know the chaplaincy, you don't realize that 80% of what you do, like I said, the person wouldn't care if you were a kangaroo, but if they're so afraid and they're stuck on the top of one of the competence obstacle course things, they just want you to get up there and talk them down and help them understand the Bible passage that will calm their fear. And so, but we want them to understand how a Christian Scientist would approach different types of situations. So that's why they have that teaching curriculum over at the Mother Church. So it's interesting, Boston University came over and asked if they could find out what it is we do at the Mother Church. And so our chaplain trainees said Dr. Porter, who was the head of, they were going to actually make a chaplain track, and they wanted to build it on what we did. And so could they come over and talk to us? And so he brings Dr. Porter over from Boston University School of Theology, and he says, well, we'd like to know what it is you're doing over here, because in all the years we've had a chaplain training program, your church's chaplain trainees are so superior in every way to any other churches. We've got to figure out what it is you're doing over here. Your people are moral, they are inspired, they know their Bible. I mean, he just went down this whole list of things, how much more so than any other churches that they dealt with. And so he said, well, what is it you do over here? And I said, well, name a topic that you guys teach about. And he goes, oh, PTSD. I'm like, oh, good. So I said, well, we do want our students to know what public thought is over there. I said, but when we come over here, I said, we recently had a session on PTSD. And I said, so the first thing we did was we went to the Bible and we cited every biblical passage and every biblical story that might relate to PTSD. And so I gave him the example. I said, well, you know, Daniel was taken and thrown in a den of lions. He'd have had to have PTSD. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown in a fiery furnace. So they'd have had to come out of it with PTSD and named, you know, oh, look at all the stuff Jesus went through, and he'd have had to have PTSD. And I said, if you name any biblical character, it's in there because they went through an incredibly unusual experience that everybody would say, oh, they probably have to have PTSD after it. And I said, but you know what? Our first observation was not one of them did. And then we asked ourselves, why didn't they? And then we went through how, if you looked at all of those biblical characters, they weren't what you call lobster Christians, that they are only good when you throw them in hot water. But they're consistently having a relationship with the Bible. They're consistently having a relationship with their sacred text. I said, our people read a Bible lesson every morning, and many people spend an hour or so on it alone, just that, not to mention how many times. And that we always, in the end of my book, I had a whole chapter on there is a biblical story for no matter what anybody is going through. I'm convinced there's a parallel. And so we looked at some of those and showed him that, and he was writing this all down and everything. So then after that, they asked us to come over and give a panel discussion for the students. But so you see how we do it is we look at, okay, here's what public thought is, but at the Mother Church, we go right to our the authority of the Bible and Mrs. Eddy's writings and study those topics. I'm sorry, did you have some?
So actually, the second part of my question was whether or not active duty.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. That's true. That's just training. I don't see active duty as hugely different than that. I think that your perception is that Christian Science chaplains are not appreciated as much as they probably should be. But what my experience has been, there is a time when you start out, and it was similar with the women because I was spit on, had my tropical fish poisoned, and was run off the road by men in stocking masks. But it's because they don't know you. And then the more they see you work, the more they see the effectiveness of what a Christian Science chaplain does, then they begin to come and ask questions. I know one of my chaplains had a big construct up when I went to Germany, and I was just there 4 days, and he had all these different traditions in it, and what did they believe about Christ, what did they believe about communion or whatever it was, and it said what all these other churches said. He was Southern Baptist. And I looked at the Christian Science one. So you're there kind of like a committee on publication as well. You'll do the general Protestant work you do, but you're also the committee on publication. And so I said to him, I know that if you give me that construct, I'll send it to our church. These aren't accurate for our church. I know our church would be willing to make them accurate for your church. And he went like that, and there was a Catholic priest standing beside me, and I said to the Catholic priest, would you say what the construct says here is accurate for the Catholic Church? And he goes, no, it's not, but our church would be willing to make it right too. And so you're constantly bringing people in to understand that so many times they don't understand what another person from another church believes. So you have to go to the direct source. And it was interesting, and he says, are you threatening me and telling me I got to take down the construct? And I said, no, I'm not. And I said, but I said, I've known you for almost a week now, and I said, you're Southern Baptist, and I know you love your Bible. And I said, I know you wouldn't want to be any part of bearing false witness against your neighbor. And he kind of went like that. And so you're turning them right back to the scripture. And he took the construct down, and he also, I explained to him that our black chaplains and assistants wouldn't come in his office because he had a Confederate flag on his wall. And he didn't, you could see there's realizations going on for him. And he took it down as well. So you're there like a committee on publication. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, no. Thank you. Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And I want to just say a special thank you to everyone who helped with this event, to Rochelle Nisdale, who's our development assistant. Thank you, Rochelle. To Lindsay Levanchi, who is our special projects manager. She may have gone back in the kitchen anyway. Thank you, Lindsay, for everything you did. And also to Tracy co-writer crew, who is our activities director. Where are you, Tracy? Are you around here? She's probably back in the garden getting things ready for lunch. Anyway, sorry? And Kelly, yes, thank you, Kelly, for all your help with getting everything ready. So thank you, and to all of our tech crew. Where's Donovan? Where'd he go? Anyway, to Donovan and John, thank you so much, and to everybody, and to all of you for being here. Thank you so much. And now we'll close with a solo from Megan. She's doing hymn 556. Thank you so much, Megan.
joy. I want to echo something that Debbie Simmons, the Broadview board president, said before about volunteering, because I felt the imperative a month or two ago to not bury my talent with music and to share it. Mary Baker Eddy wrote that the talents that he gives, we must improve. And a Christian Science nursing facility is a wonderful, nurturing, open-door environment to come and do just that and to share our gifts, which are evidence of God's love for us. So I'm so grateful to have that opportunity and to know that it's here for everyone. And so Rochelle asked me to sing after I gave that concert, and I couldn't say no, so here I am. Turning the piano on. I just chose this hymn because I love it. Our Father knows my need today and everyone's need, and all the stories you've heard are because God knows everyone's need, and if we listen, we can hear it and we can see it.
Today, I do not merely ask for happy hours or golden way or loving, helpful task, but with all trust and love I pray, our Father knows my need today. Our Father knows my need this hour, where'er my steps may go. The saving light from truth's high tower now leads me, this I know. Yours is the majesty and power, oh love divine, this day, this hour. Our Mother knows this moment's need, my work, my prayer, my song, the healing word and Christ-like deed, here where the way seems long. Truth's manna falls and I am fed, love's light shines clear and I am led. Love sets the earth bound captive free and mindful of her own. With loving care, God's leading me when wandering alone. I find in truth a living way. Our Mother knows my need today. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. All right. Now it's time to go out to the garden and have some lunch. I hope you'll join us. Thank you all.